I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows, and I've been covering crime in Florida's Panhandle for years. Welcome to my series, Gulf Coast Confidential. From murders to mysteries, I explore some of the saltier stories that surface in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf of Mexico. My co-host, of course, is Pam Hill. Pam's sister Sharon Aydelott was murdered by her own son on Christmas Eve of 2013, and because of that, Pam has a unique perspective on a lot of the cases I talk about on Gulf Coast Confidential. She is a survivor of violent crime, a grief and loneliness researcher, and a pharmacist as well. So, Pam, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Per usual, we're not diving into the happier stories today.
These are quite a trio of doozies.
Yeah, this is a trio of doozies. And we're actually calling this episode Lambs to the Slaughter. And that's the title of this episode because we're discussing several cases that involve abusers in positions of authority. Gosh, we see it so often, Pam, and they use their power to prey on vulnerable children to sexually abuse them. So we're going to start with the arrest and conviction of a Gulf Coast case involving a young man named Ryan Walsh. Ryan Walsh was the youth director at Gulf Breeze United Methodist Church when he was arrested in 2020 for sending sexually explicit texts to a 13-year-old girl in the church's youth group and later touching her. He was 27 years old at the time, and according to a civil lawsuit later filed over the case, the girl and her parents had actually just started attending the church the year before because guess what? She had been sexually abused in the 4th grade, and she and her family were looking for a safe and supportive environment. Walsh pleaded no contest to lewd or lascivious battery, and in 2022, the court sentenced him to 10 years in state prison and 5 years probation, which he is now serving at Liberty Correctional Institution under medium security. Pam, you remember when this case broke, and in some ways it wasn't that shocking. You know, Gulf Breeze, for those who have listened to us before, know that it's a bedroom community of Pensacola here in Northwest Florida. It's a quaint little community, but it's also where you would say a lot of the wealthier folks in town live. You have a lot of folks that move over there to have better schools. There's a lot of A-rated schools in that community, but because of the money, because of its location to Pensacola Beach, I think there's an air of according to some folks, they do feel a little bit perhaps entitled, I guess, to the better things in life, if you will. That's not a sweeping statement of the whole community, but there are elements of that pop up over the years with other stories that perhaps that the law isn't applicable to everyone equally, that there's a sense that things get swept under the rug because there's money to make that happen. This is not one of those situations, but we are going to get into some facts of this case that do make you wonder about initially how it was handled when the allegations were first made. So along those lines, I want to update folks before we jump into our conversation, just some of the details of the case. So how it was discovered that they were having this inappropriate communication. The girl's parents actually discovered the texting that was going on between them, reported it to the church, who then later reported it to authorities. So according to the arrest report, the victim said they started texting a few months before the fondling happened, and some of the messages were very sexual in nature. She said they also FaceTimed and sent images to each other. Walsh sent full nude pictures of himself. She also sent pictures back to him, but she did not have her clothes on, but she did have her bra and panties on. They both said that eventually they met behind the recreation center where a lot of kids' programs are, and they made out. And she said, she told the police that he did put his hands down her pants and he touched her vagina over her panties. So, you know, we'll start there. When the accusations were first reported to Gulf Breeze police, they, which I thought it was interesting reading the police reports, the parents actually called two of the pastors first, called the church leadership about the situation. And according to this lawsuit, the church leaders did not immediately report it to authorities. They, in fact, had only intended to discipline Ryan Walsh. When they first spoke to him, all he talked about was the inappropriate communications that they exchanged. Then he called him back later, according to him and them, and said, well, we did meet behind the rec center. We did make out, and I did put my hand down her pants. And then they called the police. And that just bothered me.
Right. Of course it should. Basically, he was in a position where we trust our church pastors. We trust our youth pastors. Obviously, there was a breakdown and basically not following procedures that were put in place in every church or every place. There shouldn't just be one person with teenagers, a bunch of them there.
Yeah, so there were a lot of rules, I believe, that were broken that even allowed that situation to get to that point. And it was interesting. You know, I feel like what we're going to be talking about in this case and in the next two cases is a lot of common themes and similarities in the way that these child predators operate, how they contact their victims, how they groom their victims. They use a lot of devices, whether it's cell phones, computers, and they prey upon children that are vulnerable. And I think that's exactly what we see in this Walsh case. It's what you're going to see in the other two cases that we talk about. And to that point, talking about some of the evidence that police found, you know, Ryan Walsh, I do think, was trying to minimize his involvement in that case, you know, to the point that when his arrest was first made public and it was posted online by local media, there were a lot of comments. And I noticed that there were some people that knew him and they were defending him because he had helped other children, and that people were jumping to conclusions that you're innocent until proven guilty and how harsh and judgmental people are. And then when you read that arrest report, I'm thinking they should be as harsh and judgmental as they want to be. This guy targeted a girl that everyone at the church already knew had been sexually abused. They knew. Her family came there seeking help, seeking sanctuary, seeking a safe environment for their wounded and troubled child. And instead of treating her, you know, with the kind of love and respect that she deserved, instead he took advantage of that and catered and zeroed in on her woundedness and catered to it so that she would be putty in his hands, essentially. And to hide his tracks when he gave, you know, police went to his house. He was actually at his parents' house in Navarre when they went to talk to him and you know, issue the arrest warrant. They collected his phone, and when they went through his phone, they realized that he had deleted all the messages between them. He had deleted the videos. He had deleted their communications. He'd even deleted her as a contact in his phone.
Yeah, he's pretty smart then. That's a parent's worst nightmare, is that communication, that secret communication that's going on. And basically, that trust and trickery happened right there at the church, and we're not expecting that. Our guard's down. We're thinking they're there, they're fine, they're with their friends, they're at church.
Yes, exactly. And to that end, police realized that he also had communicated with her on his work computer, and that church leadership had access to those passwords. So when they confiscated his work computer, all the tracks that he had thought he had covered on his cell phone, they found lots of communications between him on that computer. And if the church leadership had taken the time to look, they would have found it too. He didn't exactly try to hide it.
Oh, yeah. A lot of times they don't try to hide this. They just do it in plain sight, hiding in plain sight like G.I. Joe. But also this was during the pandemic as well. So a lot of things changed in the pandemic. There was a lot of isolation, a lot of people huddling up on computers and phones and TV, and it was just a weird time.
Yeah, and just the level of comfort, you know, like I said, when I was looking over that arrest report and they had listed some of the evidence, some of the communications between them, you know, one of the things that he told her was that he liked younger girls because it, quote unquote, made him feel more like a man.
Oh, my.
And he also told her that basically he fantasized about her, and he flat out said, I want to F you.
Oh, my stars.
And I can't imagine being a parent seeing that.
I can't either, but I mean, like, little girls, he picked one that wouldn't talk back. He said that some little girls, they're like, guess what? I'm fixing to bring my dad in here to talk to you. Or my mama.
Well, and that's what's so sad, because they continue to go through his computer and they find where at one point she even tells him about, because she's 13 at the time, she tells him about an older boy in high school who had also apparently been talking to her. And he got jealous, is what it sounded like to me. And he starts telling her that this guy needs to stay away from her, and that who does he think he is, considering her age? And he even acknowledges that that sounds hypocritical because of his situation. But, he basically told her, I really care for you. This guy doesn't care for you. You should report him.
Okay.
And she said, oh, should I? She said, well, he's never asked for anything sexual, and we both know who has.
Right.
And then he responded, are you going to report me? Ha, ha, ha.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you know what? Did they do a background check on him?
That's part of the civil lawsuit. They felt like that they had dropped the ball on that because these two other pastors that they were also aware of these allegations when the family called them. They didn't report it immediately to police. And in the lawsuit, they said they also failed to do a background check and some of these other things that they were supposed to have done. We'll get more into that in a minute. But yeah, it was just the arrogance, how open he was about it, how comfortable he was sharing that, knowing that that's basically a trail of evidence, and just deleting it off your phone isn't going to prevent you from being found out.
By the way, nothing's gone forever on your phone.
Yeah, I know. Even if you're not doing something illegal, just be aware, that could come back to haunt you. But yeah, so he was 27 when he was arrested in February of 2020 by Gulf Breeze PD. And he was charged with lewd and lascivious behavior involving a minor over 12 years old and under 18, transmitting obscene material to a minor, and use of computer to solicit or seduce a child. He was 29 when he made the plea deal and was found guilty of lewd and lascivious behavior of a 13-year-old, distributing obscene material to a minor, and obscene communication to seduce or solicit a child. He was sentenced in October of 2022, so last fall, to 10 years probation, or 10 years prison rather, and 5 years probation. And in that same year, there was also a lawsuit that was filed against him, Executive Pastor Kenneth York, Pastor Dan Morris, Gulf Breeze Methodist Church, as well as the Alabama West Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church, basically claiming that they didn't do their jobs. They were negligent. They didn't follow their own rules in protecting her. And as a result, she suffered severe and permanent psychological damage, emotional and physical injuries. And I just can't get over the fact that they went to the church and they knew that she was vulnerable, and yet they did not provide that safe and supportive environment that, her family wanted her to have. So because of the opportunities to be alone with minors in a religious setting, that's what the civil lawsuit gets into, basically pointing out that religious institutions are very well aware that because they are so interactive with minors, it attracts an extraordinary number of pedophiles, child molesters, and sex abusers. Church leaders are very aware of this, but instead of exercising due care and diligence, according to the lawsuit, to protect minors, church pastors in the conference allowed staff to have complete discretion and freedom to have personal and private encounters with minors, which created this unsafe environment that allowed her to be molested. And something you referred to earlier, in 2016, the conference actually adopted what's called safe sanctuaries and minimum standards. All churches are required to complete background checks on people who worked with minors and vulnerable adults, and require a 2-adult rule, meaning at least 2 adults work who are not related to each other, and they work together with the same population as above. So they need 2 people around these kids at one time. And what they're finding is that Walsh had numerous opportunities, was alone with a lot of these kids. In fact, he took the youth group to a trip to Busch Gardens at one point. The victim was a member of this group, and there were 2 other kids that got caught doing illegal drugs. They didn't say what they were, but that he was given the discretion to handle it as he thought best with no oversight.
I haven't really looked into what his degree was or this, that, and the other, but you still need to ask someone else and get counsel. And I can't imagine taking a youth group to Busch Gardens by myself. Even if everything's going great. I just can't even imagine that.
Yes, and it doesn't address whether or not other chaperones were there. I can't imagine that he was the only adult, but basically he was the authority figure. He was the person in charge. He was the person that was allowed to handle things that went right or wrong. And he had, that these 2 kids using drugs had happened under his watch.
Right.
So they're painting this picture that these church leaders were irresponsible. To your point, they didn't perform a background check on him. One of the ministers had even performed his marriage ceremony not 2 years or so before this incident happened, and had known him since he was 14 years old. So the lawsuit goes on to say that as a result of that they basically weren't even doing the bare minimum of looking to see that this guy could potentially be doing something wrong.
Grandfathered in.
Yes.
Basically grandfathered right in there.
Well, and they were blind to it. Even if he was doing it literally right under their nose.
Right.
And they weren't even going to call the cops initially. That was the other thing the lawsuit said. That they and that was the thing that got me when I was looking at the comments. There were just a lot of, in my opinion, self-righteous people criticizing others who were criticizing Walsh, basically saying, you don't know the situation. Social media, people can be so hard on each other. Yes, all of that's true, but neither did they know the situation.
Right.
And they kept saying, church leaders reported it to authorities. Yeah, after they found out their butts could be on the line because he'd actually touched her when they thought it was just explicit texting, which is also a crime. They were just going to discipline him in-house.
Right.
And I imagine, and I don't know this because it wasn't addressed in the lawsuit or the arrest records, but I can imagine that they're thinking, especially since the family called them first and not authorities, that they were like, maybe this is too embarrassing. The family may not want this to go public. Her name has not been made public, nor the family's. It's not in the lawsuit either. Maybe they thought they were going to protect everybody and make it go away, but when you see the extent of what they were doing, the communications, and you know that their first reaction was to just discipline him and not call the police, that's extremely disturbing because what else do they know about that they didn't take action on?
It wasn't the very best thinking. It wasn't good to do. And I personally know that works sometimes. That in-house, keeping it, circling it up and tightening it up and don't let anybody else know. That's what happened in my sister's case when her husband was found sexting a little girl. Pensacola High School tightened it up and all the coaches huddled together and nothing was done about it then and it still isn't done about it.
Yes, and I think that's why it's so valuable to have your perspective on a lot of these cases because you've experienced it firsthand. Your sister experienced it firsthand. Not only is she sadly a murder victim at the hands of her own son, but in the years leading up to that heinous crime in 2013, her husband at the time, Brandon's father, Randy Aydelott, was a coach and a teacher at Pensacola High School. He was fired from Pensacola High School when it was discovered that he'd been having an inappropriate relationship with a 13-year-old girl.
Same thing.
Also in his science class. Again, a person in a position of authority. He told her every year he had a favorite, and this year she was his.
Right.
She lost her phone. Their communications were discovered. But instead of immediately turning it over to police, the principal at the time, Principal Williams, who has since been elected to the Escambia County School Board, at the time, the child sex abuse investigator, Tarlonda Gooden, is no longer with the Pensacola Police Department, but she was at the time. Her son was also a football player. And, another coach, I believe it was Mike Bennett, that also met at the field house. So if you haven't listened to that, you can listen to the episode called Confessions in the Field House, which gets into the same issues that we're talking about in some of these cases.
Exactly the same.
Huddle of misogyny of these institutions to protect the abuser because they don't want to deal with the fallout as opposed to doing what's right and helping the victim.
Right. Just kick the can down the road a little bit. And it's almost like it's cookbook. It's almost prescribed. And it's almost like Ryan Walsh. He was one of the hip ones. He was a handsome man.
Yes.
He was clean cut. He was soft-spoken. He was skinny jean wearing, cappuccino swilling guy, so people are like, well, what could he do? He looks hip, my kids are okay. When it's your daughter that you're looking at her phone and you're going up to the church, you'll see it a little differently than we're going, well, they shouldn't have been so quick to judgment. It's very different when it's your family.
It is very different. And to your point, I mean, I saw some of those comments in Facebook. When people were commenting on the original arrest story a few years ago, they were saying, well, what are we doing with these hipsters anyway? Why are these churches so focused on finding somebody that can relate to the kids when they need to be finding responsible adults that can actually meet their needs?
Right.
And so I'm not here to debate that, but to your point, other people did notice that as well.
It's normal. Kids can relate to kids. It is their time. When you've got a grown man sitting down cuddling up with a 13-year-old, I'm not a psychologist or overly brilliant, but I know that ain't right.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is he told her she was the first minor that basically he'd ever been interested in, which immediately made me go, psh.
Yeah, it makes me want to throw up.
Yeah, I know. Because, again, it sounds a lot like what Randy said to her. I have a favorite to the student in his class. I have a favorite every year, and this year it's you, except he was saying that he was making her feel special in a different sort of way. You're the first one that I've ever done that with, which may or may not be true, but it certainly sounded shady. And that was something else that the civil lawsuit brought up about the Walsh case and the way that church leadership handled it by giving him carte blanche, essentially, to use social media and all these communication devices, whether it was computers or cell phones, to interact with the youth, to promote their activities. And there was no oversight. They had the passwords to look and see what he was using and what he was saying on his computer, but they never looked in. It never crossed their mind that they should look into him because they already knew him,
Right. They had confirmation bias. They saw what they saw. They knew what they knew. And he picked the exact perfect person to abuse a little girl that he already knew was having issues like that. That's even more disgusting to me.
I know. That's the thing that hurts me the most. And that's another theme that we're going to find in these other two cases that we're going to come across is these guys, they just seem to have a sixth sense, a radar for these wounded children. And that's who they gravitate towards every single time. As you and I talked about, I just recently covered a case. Just when you think the Catholic priest sex abuse scandal is over, a young man, 24 years old, recently came forward and filed a complaint with the Escambia Sheriff's Office that a priest molested him for a year and a half when he was 6th to 7th grade, basically. It was a Monsignor at his school. He would pull him out of class under the guise that he needed to help him move furniture, according to the young man. And he had been taken to that school. His parents enrolled him in that school because he had been bullied at other private Catholic schools. And they were devoted Catholics. They wanted to keep him in a Catholic school environment. And they specifically told this Monsignor, who later this child accused of molesting him, they said, please help him. He's hurting. He's isolated. He's suffered. We're bringing him here for, again, a safe and supportive environment. And I spoke with this young man's mother as well, and she was just heartsick, just wrenched with guilt. She didn't find out about these allegations until late last year, but she spoke to this Monsignor herself, and he told her, I will take him under my wing. And boy, did he.
Yeah, we didn't know what that meant at that time, did we?
Right, exactly. But to that point, even the young man and his mother, now that they understand better about how pedophiles and child predators work, they go after the ones that are wounded. They look for the ones that are isolated. They look for the ones that are hurting. And it is evil to me to the nth degree.
It is. And there is a way. Many functions that happen at the church, like, for instance, there's one that happens called Night to Shine with special needs folks out in Gulf Breeze. Is a very big thing. If you are going to be a participant in that, you will go through a background check and you will be buddied up and nobody's off autonomously. Everybody's in a team. There's a check and balance and this, that, and the other. There's a procedure for everything. Even if you're on the medical team or the hairdressing team or the food service or whatever, there is a way. We've just got to bring our game. Children are our most precious resource. We don't just throw them out to someone because we think and hope they're a good person.
Right. And I think you bring up a great point because this Night to Shine, it's one event. Everybody is on their game. And then you have these large religious institutions, and maybe it's apathy, maybe it's routine, but it basically seems like they just aren't on their game every single time because there is this level of familiarity with some of these people. And maybe because they assume one of them had known Walsh since he was 14, that he couldn't possibly be capable of something like that. And none of us are mind readers. I feel like in a lot of these cases, perhaps it comes across like I'm standing there pointing the finger saying, why didn't you know? None of us are mind readers. But when you do have, policies and there are procedures in place that can help you see beyond your own biases, whether you realize them or not. Do you think they even realize they're being biased? Do you think it's just this cavalier attitude of, gosh, we really like this guy. He looks good. He looks good on paper. He looks good in person. He represents us well. How much of that responsibility is on them? I mean, according to this lawsuit, they're saying a lot of it is. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of things like that go unchecked in every industry, every career, every business. Like, for instance, pharmacists shouldn't fill their own prescriptions. You're just too close. Doctor shouldn't write his own prescriptions for his family. We need to ask questions, and maybe we need to put a little stopgap in there and go, someone you have known forever, write a referral or write a reference, but you're not going to be the one to be directly over them. There needs to be some distance.
Pastor Morris is the one that considered Walsh like a son, according to the lawsuit, and, quote, never thought to question his actions until it was too late. But that's, again, nobody deliberately went into this going, we're going to cover for him. And if he does do something wrong, we're going to continue to cover for him. But it still bothers me that the initial reaction was just to discipline him. I mean, it is heartbreaking, but I do feel like in general, that attitude of like cutting people, you're cutting the wrong people some slack.
Right. It's deny type of thing. And I'm not saying they denied it. But the thing is, it's kind of perfectly normal to think, well, I know them. But what we have to realize is the cost of doing business, for lack of a better word, or for having a church or for having a pharmacy or whatever, cannot be the expense of a human being, a little girl, a little boy, a man, a woman. Look what this done to Ryan Walsh's life, too.
Yeah.
If they would have gotten him help, if he has pedophilia, if he has some leanings that way, I mean, you're in a church. Ask for help. He's in the place where his soul can be reached. And if you love him and have known him forever and ever, you probably can reach him. There are a lot of missed opportunities because we did not follow the right rules there. They had them in place. They simply weren't followed.
Right. And there were some people that were saying, well, he just made a mistake. And I'm like, 3 months worth of mistakes?
Yeah. Well, not with my girl. You're not going to make a mistake.
And it wasn't a one-time event. They texted for 3 months.
Yeah, that's not a mistake.
Sent her nude pictures of himself, you know, multiple times. She sent him pictures back. They arranged to meet behind the recreation center. Sure, people have not using their best thinking, as you like to say, or make poor decisions, but this was calculated. This was a decision that he made to pursue a child. It was not a one-time mistake by a young man, a boys will be boys mentality. Just infuriates me when I hear people say that.
That's not good. Well, and then I think about like, okay, that was behind the rec center. What if they got in the car and they went somewhere else or this, that, and the other? Just but by the grace of God, and I'm not minimizing any of it because I'm upset about all of it, but it just, why do we have to wait on something bad to happen? I don't understand that kind of, for lack of a better word, management.
Right. And I agree. And to your point, it did wreak havoc on Ryan Walsh's life. I mean, he's going to be in prison for years to come. I noticed when I was looking at his record in the clerk of courts files that his wife also filed for divorce the same year that the charges were filed. That is consistent. I mean, sometimes I wonder about the stuff that's stored in my memory banks, but I remember years ago there was another pastor in Pensacola who had been busted for he had been caught in a police sting. He had been online trying to arrange to have sex with, I believe it was definitely who he thought was a minor boy. I want to say the kid was he thought it was a police officer, but he thought the child was like around 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that range, somewhere between 9 and 13. And he said they made arrangements to meet someplace. But of course, when he got there, there were police and they searched his car and he had a blanket and he had sex toys and, the lubricant. And as I followed the case and I looked him up online as well in the clerk's records, and a couple of years later found where his house had gone into foreclosure. His wife had also divorced him. I mean, like you said, they're in an environment where they could get help. And I was thinking about this even with Ryan Walsh. Do you think there's ever a point where they're like, I know this is wrong, I know I shouldn't do it, but it feels good and I want to do it anyway?
Yeah, that's addiction. That is addiction. Even knowing the consequences, even knowing or even slightly thinking about that. So it is a disease, but you're not going to practice and have your therapy on children, and children need to relate to children. And as adults and peers, there needs to be distance, and we need to watch each other. If you're not doing anything wrong, you don't mind someone holding you accountable. It's when you are doing something wrong that irritates one's soul.
Right. Well, the criminal case, as far as Ryan Walsh is concerned, is over. He's serving his sentence. The civil lawsuit is ongoing, and we'll be sure to update you on that case as it continues and we get an outcome. So, Pam, what are some of your takeaways from all this?
The main takeaway I have is probably what most people over 30 have, is this right here. When your children have a cell phone, you have to look over it. You have to see what they're doing because it's kind of secret communication.
Yeah, I know. And it's every parent's worst nightmare. In fact, when I was talking to Special Victims Unit investigators with the Sheriff's Office about the priest molestation story, because the young man that I spoke to felt like there were other victims, they said without a doubt it's very rare for an experienced child predator to just have one victim.
Right.
So, and that's often how, in that particular case, he had the child right there underneath him at the school, if you will. But in these other cases with Ryan Walsh and others that we're going to discuss in Lambs to the Slaughter, those cell phones, those computers.
Right under the parent's nose.
That's right. And those investigators were telling me, don't let your kids online. Just keep them off altogether. So I know that's tough, but that was one of the takeaways that I took away from, talking to those investigators and, of course, covering so many of these tragic and sad stories because it causes so much unnecessary pain. All right. Well, thank you, Pam. And thank you for joining us. This is the first part of Lambs to the Slaughter. We've got another case coming up talking about a teacher in Escambia County who, very much like this youth pastor in Gulf Breeze, targeted children who were vulnerable. And we're going to talk about his case coming up in the second part of Lambs to the Slaughter. If you'd like to watch this episode or any others, you can check out Gulf Coast Confidential on my YouTube channel by the same name and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll see you next time.